Thank you for your patience. Got it. Okay, always something. Just one more second. We should be ready. Thank you for your, okay. Good. All right. Good evening and welcome to the New York Studio School's virtual evening lecture series. It is my great pleasure to introduce Leslie King-Hammond and Lowery Stokes Sims in conversation tonight. I want to thank Leslie and Lowery for joining us and taking time out of their busy schedules. And I'd like to thank all of you in the audience for joining us tonight as well, this chilly evening here in New York. I would also like to just quickly recognize that this New York Studio School Evening Lecture Series is generously supported in part by the public funds from the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs in partnership with the City Council, the Robert Lehman Foundation, and the National Endowment for the Arts. The programming would not be possible without the contributions of individuals as well. And many of you are in the audience, so I would like to thank you, and we're very grateful. At any time during or after tonight's talk, you might consider making a donation on our website at www.myss.org. Before I introduce our speakers, I'll just point out the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. You feel free to enter a question at any time during tonight's talk, and we'll leave some time afterwards to get to those and to ask more questions of our speakers. And we have just a note on our programming. We have one more lecture left for this season next week. So it's been a very exciting year, and tonight is one of the more exciting evenings, I would say.
Pressure.
No pressure. All right.
Be afraid.
All right. So tonight, Leslie King-Hammond is an art historian, curator, artist, and cultural art activist and community innovator. She is Professor Emerita, former graduate dean, and founding director of the Center of Race and Culture at the Maryland Institute College of Art. And Dr. King-Hammond sits on the board of the Reginald Lewis Museum of Maryland African American History and Culture, as well as the Baltimore Arts Realty Corporation, an initiative committed to developing and supporting arts and culture projects in the communities of Baltimore City. She has an active career curating exhibitions and writing essays and publications on numerous artists and cultural movements. And Dr. King-Hammond's artistry has been exhibited at the Museum of Biblical Art, the Smithsonian, Galerie Myrtis, MICA, and the James E. Lewis Museum. Her mixed media bricolage works explore the anonymity of women's work and the intersection of African diasporic and spiritual beliefs. Lowery Stokes Sims is a specialist in contemporary art, craft, and design. She served on the education and curatorial staff of the Metropolitan Museum of Art as executive director and president of the Studio Museum in Harlem, and retired as curator emerita from the Museum of Art and Design. More recently, she has worked as an independent curator and consultant for numerous exhibitions at various institutions, including the Contemporary Arts Center in Cincinnati, Craft Contemporary in Los Angeles, and the Baltimore Museum of Art. She was visiting professor at the Institute of Fine Arts at NYU and has been appointed the 2021 Cress Beneke Professor at the Center for Advanced Study in the Visual Arts at the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. And it was our great pleasure here at the New York Studio School to honor Lowery this year and our annual benefit in the fall. So without further ado, please join me in a virtual welcome for Leslie King-Hammond and Lowery Stokes Sims.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
So I'm so pleased that you've joined us tonight. I've known Leslie King-Hammond since we were Girl Scouts and Queens in the 1950s. And then we sort of reunited as undergraduates and as graduates, actually. Undergraduates at Queens College, and then she encouraged me to come to Baltimore where I graduated to study art history at Johns Hopkins. And so here, this is one of my favorite photographs of us with a cohort of African-American undergrads and grads around 1971. Leslie is kind of in the middle with a big afro and glasses, looking very kind of like, you know, Pam Grier. And I'm over here holding a baby, which is not mine, I should say. And this was like, you know, we're still in contact with many of the individuals, you know, who are in this wonderful photograph. So I returned to New York, and Leslie stayed in Baltimore. And as I got a job at the Met, she finished her doctoral degree and began a long career at the Maryland Institute College of Art, where she was a catalytic and dedicated teacher and a nurturer of generations of artists. To that, we can add her voluminous work as a curator and a pioneering scholar of contemporary art, which established a place and a context for global Black artists in the human story of the history of art. So Leslie, what I'd like for us to do is for you to start talking about your time at MICA. When were you appointed the Dean of Graduate Studies?
Oh boy, talk about going back, digging deep. This was an unplanned part of my life. I began teaching at MICA while I was a grad student at Johns Hopkins in 1973. And as I finished in 1976, I was looking for a job, and the dean of the graduate school position became open. At the time, it was a part-time position because the schools were very small at that time, and the prior director, the prior dean, had always functioned as a two-part person because that person ran the graduate school and the continuing studies school. So I applied, and before you knew it, the then president asked me, well, because there were quite a few applications. In fact, I believe half the faculty had already applied. And I told him, I said, look, the only thing I know is that I did not have the most pleasant graduate experience at Johns Hopkins. So I know what should not happen for the graduate student. And so I have a very good idea how we should be able to create a powerful program for graduate students. I said, the second reason you should hire me is that I have absolutely no political affiliation, alliances, allegiances, collaborations, partnerships, or private secret agendas with anyone on this campus or in this city. So I'm a very neutral party. That was in, I would say February of 1976. And I never heard another word from the president or the committee or anything. And then in the May meeting, all of a sudden, the president decides at the faculty meeting, he goes through all the business. He says, now I have a few announcements. And he announces that he is appointing me the Dean of Graduate Studies, upon which there was a huge, vaudable, oh my God, in the audience. And my head dropped down because who wants to start a new job like that? Yeah. So that's how I began at MICA. I began as a graduate dean, and I said I'd keep the job as long as I could continue to teach.
Okay, that leads to my next question. So you did continue to teach while you were dean. Talk about the courses you taught, because they were kind of revolutionary, I think, for MICA, and also your pedagogical methodology, because every artist I know who's in your class talks about that.
Well, first of all, I have to say, it was pretty audacious of me to move into this arena. One, I'm teaching at a school that is committed to training professional artists. So the first thing is, how do you keep them awake? All right, because they're usually up all night working in their studios. And as I'm coming in the morning, they're going home to sleep and come back later for their classes. So one of the things I began to do was I shifted the scheduling of the courses, which made the whole school shift their scheduling, because I felt that when you divided up a class, an art history class, in 3 sessions in the week, you lost the momentum and the continuity. So I told them that I wanted to teach either a full morning 3-hour class or a full afternoon class. Well, they balked at it, but eventually they tried it and the students began to love it. Then I began to teach each art history course, and I should say the first art history course I began to learn a lot from. Teaching was as much me learning as me trying to get the students to learn. So the first course that I had that really scared the bejesus out of me was that god-awful survey. You know, the one from prehistoric to Middle Ages, and then you go from Middle Ages to contemporary. Oh my God, that was just, and the person who had been teaching it was on sabbatical, and the the registrar said, Leslie King-Hammond has agreed to teach it, and so all you students who have hated this course, you better take it with her. I walked into the room and there was 119 students in the room. I literally had a heart attack. Well, as I began to teach, I began to realize that unless I got these students engaged on one level, which was to see the art as best as possible within the time period of the people who lived and created it. And if they didn't understand what challenges those artists had within that time period to make the art, that they would lose the whole meaning of these various cycles and movements in art. So in that big class, I did a test experiment. I went, and then when I got to the Renaissance section and I said, okay, we're going to do, these are your final projects. Final projects were that they had to create a visual project using one of the mediums from the Renaissance. The only thing I told them they couldn't do was they weren't allowed to make gesso because it's sloppy, funky, and it smells bad, all right? But they could use any other technique. And then they would have to bring in the project at the end, and then we would have to look at what they were doing. Immediately, it became very clear that they were not upset or intimidated with my presence or critique. They immediately got concerned with the critiques that the peer group were bringing forward. And so that began to let me know how to teach art history. So whatever courses I taught, and then I began to create courses. I was originally brought to MICA to teach a course on African American art because the 70s, it was the Black Arts movement. Students were demanding, presence in the classroom. So I started to teach the classes so that students could talk about the contemporary issues that were challenging them or motivating them or confusing them, and then integrating those issues into why the arts were important at that various presses. So I started with a course called Concepts in Afro-American Art. Then after a few years after I got appointed dean, I changed it to Africans in the New World. And I began to teach about the first Africans that came to the Americas prior to slavery, which the students were absolutely mesmerized with. Now, mind you, this is a predominantly white school. My classes were always oversubscribed. I had a cap limit of 25. I would end up sometimes with 35 or 40 students in a class. And I would tell them, if you're in this class, you have to participate in the class. You have to be like in a village. You have to come in with your own ideas. I'm 50%, you're 50%. So my teaching became very collaborative. I then would also, as I moved into and I started to teach African art forms, I would bring in pieces of my own collection so that they had physical, tactile. I would take them to movies. I would take them to field trips. I would take them to New York every semester. When I started to teach women in the history of art, I got a lot of pushback from the female members of the faculty at MICA at the time. They wanted to know, why was I teaching that? I said, if I have to answer that question, then you need to turn in your estrogen because you have failed as a woman. And so what I did with women is that I started all the way back with the Venus of Willendorf. And I said, come on, let's take a good look at how women were portrayed and what the meanings really are. And it was revelatory to them. Then I would bring in artifacts and items that women had made that were of anonymous origin. Nobody knew because they didn't record the history of women. And then they began to understand. And then I would send them out for final projects. I said, do a project on a woman who was the most important influence in your life to become an artist. All right. So as long as I created experiences that drew them back to the center of who they were, that's how they began to learn and come and consistently. And some of them would come back and sit in on my classes 2 and 3 semesters in a row.
Sounds good. So I think one of the capstone achievements of your deanship were the Ford and Philip Morris fellowships that you gave out between 1985 and 98, which encompassed MICA, Yale, the Art Institute, Cal Arts, and Cranbrook. And here are some of the incredible artists that came out of this. Tell me about how this program came about and what was its purpose, and how do you now, looking at it, feel that it sort of impacted the art world?
Well, at the time that I was a dean, I was one of the rare few persons of color in the whole nation, in the whole country, who was running a graduate school. And the president of the school at the time, Fred Lazarus, couldn't understand that if I was a Black woman, how come my admission statistics did not reflect a greater percentage of students of color coming to want to go to grad school. And so after several conversations, I had to remind him that the problem wasn't Black or white or red or brown, the problem was green. Mm-hmm. And that if students didn't have money, they couldn't come to school, even though they would like to, they just could not afford it. We were a private art school and we had a certain amount of prestige, and they just didn't see a way forward. So he said, well, I think I have a way to get some money for this program. You know, we could have a program of artists of color. And I said, fine. He said, but he said, it's a short timeline. It's only 5 months. He said, before, you know, we would have to have this money allocated. And I said, please, I know where the artists are. You get the money, I'll find the students. And so I had to use, again, unorthodox methods in order to recruit. Whereas there were portfolio days and studio visits and students coming, I went on the road and I literally found students and I would follow them, track them. In one case with Tom Miller, who was one of the first ones to come into the program, he was an artist in the community in my neighborhood, lived around the corner. And every day he would come by, we would be sitting on our steps in Baltimore at the end of the day, and he would be walking his dog, and he would be complaining because he was a teacher in the public school system. And he said, oh, I wish I could just paint all the time. And I said, oh, Tom, I said, you're doing such amazing work. I said, next time you walk by, bring me some slides. So he brought some slides. And I said, I'm doing a lecture. That was always my con job. I would just say, bring me some slides so I could, you know, put you in my next lectures. Well, in about 2 months, he was walking around the corner again. And this time he sits down on the stoop next to me and he looks at me and he says, you know, I got a letter from MICA. It was signed by you as the dean of graduate school. And it said that I have a full tuition scholarship to go to Maryland Institute to get my master's degree. And I said, oh, I can't imagine how that happened. So from actually literally filling out the application, paying the fee for the student, putting in the slides, to getting the word out to my colleagues in the field, who would then call me up and say, I have a great student I'm sending to you, all right? Or students who would meet me, or artists who would meet me at conferences, at College Art Association meeting, at National Conference of Artists meetings. And I would say, look, you need a master's degree. Come in here while I have this money. And so these artists came to MICA and to these other schools, because this was a collaborative event. I was the project director. And what happened is that the fellowship was designed to create not only artists to get MFA degrees, but also be able to go into the system, the academic system, to become professors, which is what all of these individuals are doing, every last one of them. And some of them have really stepped up their game and have become mainstream artists.
Yes, definitely. Here's let me see. Hold on a second. Sorry.
Going
Here's
to
some more of your art history students.
right.
Tell me, what made you, what do you think made these artists so distinctive? I mean, they all have, a great number of them have a great presence on the art world. I mean, Amy Sherrill, just for an example.
Right.
What made them really distinctive in your eyes?
I think my presence on the campus of MICA gave them affirmation and comfort to know that there was somebody who looked like them, who was successful in the art world. They had not known that there were any Black PhDs in art history, all right? Some of them began to know that I also made art, but it was not the first thing that I led with in my life, because I didn't want any of them to ever feel that I was in competition with them. That was my salvation and my sanctity and my space, my safe space to process out what I was working on. But each one of these individuals, each had their own specific vision, and they were trying to figure out how to fit into the canons of that time that they were coming through. And I would tell them, you don't need to fit into a canon. You need to figure out who you are and what fires your muse and what is the catalyst and inspiration for what you're trying to do. And then come back and look at yourself and make sure you are in sync, and then move forward with your art. So each one of these individuals came out to be a totally individualized being. And many of them were, you know, like Lola Flash and her photography at the beginning of her career. She was so trepidatious, all right? She was at a time where she was coming out. She was early in the LGBT community. And I did not have those kinds of biases. Having experienced bias so rigorously and relentlessly, I tried very hard not to engage in that behavior. And these are just the artists of color. I haven't even listed the artists who were not Euro-Americans, who are equally doing well. But these are the ones who just catapulted and just thrived under the presence of being in a class and being allowed to do what they felt compelled to do.
Okay. Now, what has always impressed me is that how you've all also been a prevalent presence in the Baltimore community. You're constantly networking, activating projects, serving on panels, lecturing, presenting on occasions too numerous to count, getting all your friends like me to sort of be involved in your projects. We could, as Sam did, you could single out your service on the board of the Baltimore Museum, BARCO, the Reginald Lewis Museum of Maryland History and Culture, and more recently, you were a research scholar for the Robert Deutsch Foundation, where you were involved in the foundation's work on the Arts Corridor on North Avenue in Baltimore. Can you characterize your activism on behalf of the arts in Baltimore? And I'd also like you to sort of like really talk about what you think distinguishes the art scene in Baltimore.
All right. My connectivity with the community really comes from New York, my experience growing up, and my first training as art experiences in New York, from after-school programs and Bible school programs and recreational center programs, because my parents didn't have a whole lot of money. I did have 2 years of training at the Brooklyn Museum Art School. A godfather paid for that for me. But the other thing that was very critical in this was my research that began with Jacob Lawrence, and understanding how Jacob Lawrence came to be where he is as a result of the networking in the community.
Mhm.
Now, when it comes to Baltimore's art community, and why did I stay in Baltimore? The first two artists that I met while I was in grad school at Johns Hopkins were John Waters, the filmmaker, and Joyce J. Scott, the glass bead impresario of Baltimore. And I looked at the two of them and watched them in their early careers. And they were the wackiest, funkiest, wonkiest individuals that you can possibly imagine. If you Google either one of them, you will find there isn't a straight arrow in their bucket if you pay them. And I was absolutely fascinated with what was this community doing to allow this kind of creativity to literally flourish. Now, true, I was born and raised in New York. New Yorkers believe that, that's the only state in the union, that no other state matters.
No,
But
actually, it's the city.
It's the city. That's true.
City.
It's the city. And so I just felt that this city was so user-friendly for creativity, because in fact, it was sort of off the beaten track and people were always ignoring it. And I got to do things in this city that I could not ever have done in New York. And so as I began to move around and acclimate myself in this city, I said, I think I'm going to hang out here and see what becomes of the artists in this city. And so as my career has proliferated, I note a lot of my colleagues that go, wait a minute, what is going on in Baltimore? Where are all these artists coming from? Well, I used to call myself a shadow warrior in Baltimore, which is a joke now, because sort of everybody knows my name. As somebody said, your name precedes you. But people would call me when they wanted to do projects that needed kind of an intermediary or a facilitator or an activator or an ombudsman to go through city channels or neighborhood associations or institutions. And I would gladly jump in and say, okay, this is the way we can do it. And this is the way it can happen. And so I have always been open to the possibility that art can change lives, art can improve communities, and art can be an open path to change. And so, and it also taught me, because when I began to be a graduate dean, I was looking at a lot of the artwork I was having to critique. And I was like, given my training, I should not like some of this work. And then as I began to critique my training in art history, the formalistic aspects of it, I said, you don't have to abide by those canons. You can allow for differences in ways of creating and being a catalytic inspiration to individuals to allow their true expressions to follow through and move forward. And so, yeah, I have been as much a teacher as I have been a learner.
Okay, I'm going to sort of fast forward through some stuff because—
Go ahead, because I talk too much.
Yes, but we also have to leave time for questions. And I just
understand.
wanted to sort of show Tom Miller's work so people could have an idea. Say something briefly about Tom's work.
Tom is that artist around the corner, and what he would do is, with his little red truck, when he wasn't walking his dog, he would, because Baltimore is a great space to reclaim old furniture. This is a 300-year-old city, and people are always throwing out stuff. So Baltimore used the people, Tom Miller used the people in Baltimore and the communities in Baltimore to be the catalyst for his work. So you see here, summer in Baltimore, what are they doing? Eating crabs, one of their favorite things. You see over here, a chair that he made, and he was so witty, he was so funny. And he would then add, those are his hands who made this chair. All right. And many of these were commissions. And then some of these were just Tom just playing. And he called this Afro Deco. This was his address. This is how he translated art history. He made Art Deco his force of creativity.
Okay, and then just briefly, Willie Birch, based in New Orleans, was a student of yours, and you've done a lot of work with him.
Willie Birch was one of my first graduate students. Even before I was appointed, he came to MICA to get his master's degree in teaching. We developed a long-time friendship. Eventually, he had a retrospective after having acquired numerous awards that would travel his show would travel the country. But at the time, Katrina hit and everything was shut down in New Orleans. And so I went to the president and he had already decided with other art schools that any art student in New Orleans would be able to come to one of the private art academies to continue their degree to until New Orleans got themselves back together. And he said, and for Willie Birch, he said, bring him here back to Baltimore. We'll give him a residency, a place to live. And instead of his retrospective starting off at the New Orleans Museum of Art, it will start off at MICA and then do all the venues. And then by the time New Orleans was back together 2-3 years later, his show would be there. And we did performance things. Willie Birch drove me crazy, but we did some of the most fascinating projects with him. He did a series of prints. He worked with the students. And then at the end, we did a parade through the city to stop the violence, which was a theme that is going through most urban centers. And the students gave out buttons and we had a marching band, and he did it New Orleans style so that he could teach the students the role of performance and interactive community. So, you know, when an artist comes with ideas, I just go with it. This person, just go back to Joyce Scott 1 second. I live around the corner from Joyce Scott, okay? I saw her at an art festival. This crazy woman is just wedged between two tables selling artwork. And I look at her and I talk to her and I said, what? And she's making stuff out of buttons and beads and found objects. And I bought some stuff and I said, well, where do you live and what are you doing? She tells me this wild ass story about she's a single parent and she has 5 children and she's got to support them. And I just look at her and I go, she's lying. I know she's lying, but she's not really lying. She's performing. Okay, fast forward. She is now a MacArthur Genius, 2016, and Lowery has curated 2 mega exhibitions of her work. Okay, move, Lowery. Next.
All right. Just want to sort of mention your curatorial ritual and myth. I'm trying to get to you as the artist.
I know.
And ashe to amen. And I think that all of your sort of teaching and your interaction with artists have sort of really informed, you know, like how you approached your exhibitions. Can you briefly say what you were focusing on in these 2 exhibitions?
Well, I have always, I started off being trained. I have a BFA in fine arts from Queens. And so I always loved being a maker. But at the same time, I was always fascinated with different spiritual and religious beliefs. I'm not a practitioner of any denomination. I'm just interested in the objects and the dynamics of how people use spirituality in their lives. So the first project I did was with the opening of the Studio Museum in Harlem, when I did their myth and ritual and myth exhibition. And I drew on people who were drawing back into their own histories and their own practices. And this was also a part of the time of the Black arts movement flourishing. Well, this research continued. It just would never go away. In spite of what I was doing and teaching, I was always fascinated. I'm collecting bones and rocks and all kinds of materials and handmade things by women with no names attached to them. And so I am working now with a gentleman by the name of Vincent Winbush, Dr. Vincent Winbush, who has established the Institute of Signifying Scriptures. And in the year 2000, he got a humongous grant from the Ford Foundation to examine the question of African Americans and biblical imagery. Well, I was one of the few people invited to a series of lectures, 3 days, where all aspects of the practice, the belief, the denominational forces, the scriptures, the ecumenicalism, can't even pronounce the word, was used to embolden and affirm the life and the spirituality of African Americans. And it was at that time that I said, I'm just going for broke. So I wrote grants to the school, helped me write grants to the Andy Warhol Foundation. And I was first given a curatorial grant to go around the world. And I went to the Czech Republic and to Australia to participate in 2 conferences on spirituality at the international level. And then I came back and created this exhibition called Ashe to Amen, African Americans in Biblical Imagery. Ashe is the word that means in Yoruba to make it happen, let it be so. And Amen is in the biblical tradition.
Okay.
Then in between that, I did gumbo. Yeah,
Right.
yeah.
All right. I just thought that in terms of Ashe, that we should just sort of take a moment to pause and remember the passing of Robert Ferris Thompson,
Oh,
the eminent Afro-Atlantic scholar who has influenced all our lives and all our scholarship. All right.
that has made us all just weak. But he left such a legacy that we will be enriched forever.
Right. So you did Gumbo Yaya. This is probably one of the early anthologies of contemporary African American artists.
I did this with Mid-March Arts Press, and then I rolled into, I was meeting Jacob Lawrence and working with Jacob Lawrence. And right after I did Ashe to Amen, I rolled into working on the catalog raisonné project for Jacob Lawrence, the only catalog raisonné of an African American artist in the annals of art history. And as soon as I finished working on that project, and I wrote the lead essay for that, Over the Line, which was also an exhibition that traveled for years, then I began immediately working on Hughie Lee-Smith, with whom I also had a relationship. I was very blessed to know both artists, so I didn't have to feel like my nose was stuck in a book all the time or archival papers trying to draw things out. These 2 icons literally fed me, nurtured me. Jake would say, don't let them fool you, Leslie. That's not what I was doing. No, do it this way. Yes, Jake. Yes, Jake. And then Hughie was always such a gentle, elegant master. Okay. And he would just say, yes, Leslie, that's the way to go. Okay. No. Because I tend to get very excited about things. And he says, no, take it down. So they were both very instrumental in cultivating how I would approach subjects and try to adhere to, or at least be respectful of, the personalities and the ideologies of each of these artists, so that you got a sense of truly who they were and what they were about.
Right. And I just stuck in this slide, just to talk about a current project you're doing on Jake, about his stay in Nigeria in the 1960s.
Yes, I'm working with the Chrysler Museum right now, who is doing a major exhibition again on Jacob Lawrence and his not adventures, but his venture of discovery in Nigeria, in the Mbari workshops outside of Lagos, Nigeria. The Mbari workshop were a group of artists and visual artists and writers who published a journal called Black Orpheus that was addressing issues of modernism as they looked at the Harlem Renaissance and the New Negro movement as espoused by Alan Locke and Du Bois and Langston Hughes and Claude McKay. So Jacob Lawrence went and spent time in the mid-60s and in the mid-70s. And my part of the project was to look at the question of, aside from Jacob Lawrence, what other African-American artists went back to Africa? Which at the time I thought was a nice, cute little topic until I started to get into it, and it consumed my life. And it became so humongous that, of course, I wrote way past the essay limitations to the point where I knew I had a book, and now I'm working on the book, and I'm working on an exhibition opportunity as we get ready for this exhibition, which will open at the Chrysler Museum in the fall of, I think, 22.
Now, so, audience.
Yes.
While Leslie is known for her work as a teacher and a curator and activist, more recently, we were reminded that she started out as a visual artist. We call this Leslie coming out of the closet. And she never really let go of her seminal impulses and talents as a visual artist. So this next part of our conversation will sort of focus on what was revealed by a recent exhibition of her work and her scholarship in the exhibition Deep Waters, Meditations on Time, Space, and Memory, which was at the Montserrat College of Art in September through November. So Leslie, I'm going to ask you a series of questions, and you can sort of, compress your answers as
Sure.
you may. What does it mean for you to have an exhibition of your work at this moment in life? When did you first know you were an artist, and what kind of things did you make? Talk about your formal studio art education and who are your early mentors. And then we'll go into installation work.
Okay. I very early in my life loved to watch my father and my grandmother, who were both extremely skilled. My grandmother was a seamstress who came from Barbados. And my father, whose family came from Barbados, was a skilled master carpenter. And so in those days of segregation, where you just couldn't go to the store and just buy anything, we were families of makers, most African-American families. You had to either that, or you went to the Goodwill, or you upcycled, or you recycled, or you had hand-me-downs or leftovers. And we were very adept at not waste, not want not. I was also a child of Depression culture parents. So I was very cognizant of the preciousness of materials and objects. As I mentioned earlier, I did, as a child, my mother thought I needed culture because that was the way we were trained in those days. And my uncle was a classical pianist who had studied with the GI Bill at the Sorbonne. And he would come and give me piano lessons to a great waste. And so finally he decided that maybe he lived in Brooklyn, and Brooklyn Museum had an art school, and he would pay for 2 years for me to go. And on Saturdays, my father would drive me into Brooklyn, and I would take art classes there. I was probably 10-ish, 11-ish, somewhere between 9 to 11 years old. So, and that was after I had won a poster contest in my school. And so they said, oh, maybe she does like art. But the other thing is that life was crazy growing up, and all families are dysfunctional, and mine was no different. And so when I needed time out, or I was assigned time out, I would be sent to my room, and underneath my bed, I would have a cigar box, a Cuban cigar box that my father gave me. And I would have my stuff in it, where I would have my scissors and my scraps that my grandmother would give me, and I would make my stuff. And as I became a Girl Scout, I was in charge of doing little arts and crafts projects with the troop. And I would just always make things. And I remember going to a powwow with the Shinnecock Indians in Southampton, Long Island, with my grandmother. And we were walking through looking at all of the items that the Indigenous Americans had made. And I was very struck with some of the beaded items. And she said, hey, I'll buy you a beaded, a bracelet or something. And I looked at her and I said, no. And I pointed at this thing, and it was a loom. It was a bead loom. And she said, I said, no, I want the beads so I can make my own. And she said, okay. And she bought me the beaded loom. And so my family just sort of like threw up the towels and just said, because they didn't think art was really a great way. So long story short, and I could give you wonderful stories about my interactions with the arts. But as I fast forwarded through my life, I found myself with a job in the anti-poverty program, teaching art on the streets of Bedford-Stuyvesant, with a truck and 12 high school kids and easels, setting them up in parks twice a day so that students could have on the street experiences in the arts. And someone came around looking for students to go to college. And I said, well, all my students here with me are in high school and they're not ready for college. And she was so frustrated. She said, well, have you finished college? And I said, no, I haven't finished college yet. So she said, give me your name and address. Fine. All right. Summer's over. I'm sitting at my mother's kitchen table and my mother says, all right, now what are you going to do? Because in a West Indian household, idle hands are the devil's workshop. All right. So I didn't have a plan. So I'm opening up my mail that I had ignored for about 2 weeks. And I read this letter and I go, oh my God. And I give it to my mother. I said, read this so that make sure I'm reading what I'm reading. I can't believe it. So my mother reads the letter. She gets up from the kitchen table. She goes into the living room, gets her pocketbook, comes back, pulls out a $20 bill, gives it to me. And she says, you will go, you will take bath, you will put on fresh clothes, put on decent shoes, and you will go to Queens College after you call. All right. What it was is I had been awarded a full tuition scholarship to attend Queens College to major in anything I wanted with a stipend and also all my books paid. Consequently, I became a full-time art student under the tutelage of Herbert Ock, John Ferrin, Louis Finkelstein, who literally took me under their wing and nurtured me and actually wrote all my letters of recommendations to Johns Hopkins University and asked me, why the hell did you want to go to that racist institution? Well, they had also offered me a full scholarship to go to school. And I said, why not? And the rest is history.
So as we can see from this image, and these images, which are the same installation, but this was done in Maryland.
Right.
And here and here, you have a special predilection for installations. What is that about that art form that really appeals to you? How do you go about collecting and assembling the various elements for your installations?
First of all, I have a passion for women's handwork. So anything crocheted, knitted, tatted lettuce, go back 3 slides. In my family, go back. Yes, right there. Yeah, you will see on the wall 3 framed objects. Mm-hmm. Well, those are lace and tatted work that my aunts had done. These are actually items that, I have inherited from my family. Across the altar are pieces that were done by unknown women or women in India, women in China, anywhere where they do lace or embroidered handwork. And so I go through flea markets and I go through junk stores and I go through people's basements, or I will go through whatever Goodwill to find these objects. And I just like them for their patterns. I like them for their beauty, and I like them for their statements. And then I position them with traditional African cloths. In this particular case, these are Ashoki cloths, which are bridal cloth made for Nigerian brides. And I contextualize them. Most of the first one in the center, this is called Barbadian Spirits. And that came from literally Deborah Willis, a curator at the time at the Smithsonian Institution, doing an exhibition called Artist Scholar. What happens to individuals who decided to abdicate their artist careers in deference to becoming art historians because of the demands and the needs? So she paired me in an exhibition with David Driscoll and Floyd Coleman and Ed Sorrell's Adewale. And I was the only female. And so when she came to my house to make the curatorial list, she walked into my front living room and I said, come on, let's go up to my studio, which was on the 3rd floor at a townhouse, a 19th century townhouse. And she walked into the front living room, completely ignoring me. And she said, what is this? And it was, I had a fireplace. And that's what my fireplace looked like, because I would place the items on the fireplace of memories, ashes of ancestors and family members who had passed, and decorated with the laces. And in the center, I had a what we call a monkey pot from Barbados, which was a pot that held water that was be on the front doorstep of everyone's house, so that when people wanted water, they would have cool water to drink. So I would listen to the items, the elements that spoke to me, and I would pair them together so that there would be a conversation that I would live with. So these are all things I lived with, okay? And so when I was asked to do this exhibition, they just said, you know, we want that altar. And I went, okay, and that's where it started.
So I think one of the important sculptures and installations is Praise House for Seneca Village that you created with your late husband, Jose McFeely. And I'd like to focus on this work, which was done in 2005-06, and was in an exhibition I did with the Historical Society, in light of the Met's new period room installation that also takes as its subject the fate of Seneca Village as its main themes.
Right.
So talk about your working process together on this project and what you wanted to sort of convey. And I know you haven't been to New York yet, but what's your impression of the Met's period room?
I am absolutely enamored of anything that they're writing about it, and all images that have been put into the media. And the first trip that I take to New York, which will be the first one that I have taken in New York since COVID, will be to the Met to see that Afrofuturism room. Seneca Village, for those of you who are not especially aware of it, was a village located in Central Park from the early 19th century to the mid, probably 1850s. And as Lowery was working on this exhibition called Artists Respond to Slavery in New York City, I believe that was the title of the exhibition. My husband, my late husband, was an architect who also was a teacher, taught architectural students, and also had his own practice, so that he was very familiar with building houses and buildings and dormitories and hospitals and all those things that architects do. So when he and I got together and Lowery was working on this, Lowery was talking about the exhibition, and we had been very much aware of the discovery of the African burial ground in Lower Manhattan. And so I had been doing research. And when I got to Jose's house one weekend, I had downloaded information off the internet. And I said, you know, I lived in New York all my life, and I did not know about Seneca Village, which was an African-American community, which also had some German and Irish residents in it, that flourished during this time period. So I gave this information to my husband, who looked at, and I had the original schematics from the streets and the towns that were the properties as they were outlined in the records of New York City's early maps. And he converted it into a kind of a conceptual framework. And I looked at it and I went, oh my God, I could stitch this, because I was also interested in early 17th, 18th, 19th century samplers that were done by women to demonstrate their prowess and their ability to read and write, because many of them incorporated the alphabet and the numbers. And I just was looking at different ways in it which women's handwork traditions. And then, of course, I'm teaching and I'm looking at the Bayeux tapestry. And then I'm looking at all the women around the world who use this. And the real catalyst for it was Madame Defarge from The Tale of Two Cities. And I said, how do you do that? Knit people's names, all right? So I'm fascinated with the way fiber plays this role. So anyway, Jose got carried away and he ran away with it. And the next thing I know, I got there on Friday. By Sunday, he had already created a schematic design because Lowery Sims had commissioned us to do something to address the whole question of Seneca Village in New York's history. So he had created this plexi house like a cabin that was built back in the 18th and 19th century and would have been made out of wood in Seneca Village. And then I decided to bead a sequin floor because I had been doing research about how in many of the slave cabins on many of the plantations, the floor underneath the boards were kept various items which are in my installation, crystals and rocks and stones and shells and small fiber objects that had special significance to the people who were there, who were trying to retain their religious and spiritual beliefs. And so he and I contextualized this. So when I would go back to Baltimore to teach during the weekdays, I would leave the Seneca Village sampler piece with him and he would begin to stitch. And the stitching was done with beads and shells and metals and all kinds of stuff. And then I would come back and then he would be stitching on one end and I would be stitching on the other end. And we packed it up, put it in I had a PT Cruiser at the time. It fit in the PT Cruiser immaculately. And we drove it to New York and parked right in front of the New York Historical Society. So we knew it was a divine intervention. We couldn't believe that we had come all the way from Prince George's County in Maryland up to New York City with no problem and parked right in front of the Historical Society to deliver this piece. So this was our pride and joy.
Yeah. So we're coming towards the end of our conversation here, and I just wanted to sort of have you briefly talk about the close association and collaboration you've had with this group of women who are known as the Girls of Baltimore. And I'm proud that I have been sort of inducted as an honorary member. Ellen Burchnell, Aletha Devane, Linda De Palma, Patty Tornalone, and Joyce Scott. Just talk briefly about your collaboration and work that came out of that collaboration.
We were a group of women who, at the time of the Black Arts Movement, you'll also recall that the feminist movement was on the rise. And Patty Tornalone, Linda De Palma, and Ellen Burchnell were also in the classroom teaching and having problems with certain things. So Joyce Scott, being the rascal and the rabble-rouser, decided that we should all get together and really have our own particular convenings to talk about the problems of being women in the art world and how to navigate the problems that would come up and how to also collaborate on artworks. We then named ourselves the Girls of Baltimore. We've been together for more than 30 years. Lowery survived a rigorous initiation launched by Joyce Scott herself. and I think in the mid 2000, we got a National Endowment of the Arts grant to do a collaborative print, which we did and was in a prior slide. And we also were able to do workshops with school teachers to teach them how to navigate classroom problems as well as social and political problems that were increasingly becoming difficult in the educational arena. And we are still active today, busy doing projects. Yeah.
So I just want to sort of end, on where you are now with your passion for fiber arts, specifically the MICA Raffle Quilt Club that we're both involved with currently. And just talk about your feelings about being involved with that program.
Well, you know, the MICA Quilt Club began long before the pandemic. And when they began, I think it was back in 2015, they would meet on site at MICA in one of the fiber studios. Then the pandemic hit and they were just not able, no one was able, everything shut down. But the members of the club wanted to continue to work. And the pandemic was extremely stressful for many people. And for me, it was particularly daunting because I had just lost my husband just before the pandemic hit. So I was in a foul funk. I was just in a foggy, foul grief. I don't know. I was a wreck. And I was just numb. So a friend started talking about this quilt club where they would make quilts and then raffle them off to raise money for students. So I said, oh, that's interesting. I know how to sew. And they were doing hand sewing because, of course, many people couldn't get to the studios to get to the machines. So I said, I think I'll try it. And then, of course, I harassed the Lowery, which is my job. And I said, you need something to do because she was in crisis because she had moved from Baltimore to New York. I mean, she had moved from New York to Baltimore. So she was in a transitional crisis. And so we began to work on these quilts. And so this is one of the first quilts we did, this log cabin quilt. And then the one in the center, Black Lives Matter quilt, is a block I did for what we call the viewfinder, where we had to talk about the things that were on our minds and we were experiencing during the pandemic, because during the pandemic, we made, I think, over 12 quilts.
Yeah.
And then up at the top, I was making a quilt for my son and it had a turtle in it. And Lowery started moaning and groaning that she loved the turtle. And so I made her own block with a turtle on it.
Yes.
All right. And so now, yes, I'm deeply ensconced and my fiber work has gone into doing story quilts for my family, for my son, both. My son here in the white shirt, that's my birth son. The other one in the black shirt that's Rasan. And then Terrence, and Terrence just got married and had a baby. And so he's getting married in the spring. And so I'm making him his quilt for his wedding present. So I'm just like, I'm thrilled if I get to, exhibit my quilts. And I have to say, I did do a quilt with Joyce Scott's mother back in, oh my God, it was back in the 80s. And I call it Leslie's Mother Monster, a testament to my arrogance. That's the quilt. Because when I had made the quilt, which was a log cabin design, and I gave it to her because she had started to do a highly embellished quilts. I said, Mom, can you put some embellishment on it? She said, oh, sure. And when she gave it back to me, I was so embarrassed. I was so completely and totally embarrassed at the brilliance of what she had done. I called the quilt a testament to my arrogance. So I had a passion from doing that one quilt, and never, because my life was so busy writing and teaching and traveling and lecturing, I couldn't get back to the quilt. But then when I was able to get back to it with this quilt club, there are about 40 of us, Lowery, who are in this, and we Zoom every week. We Zoom and we share our blocks and we talk about techniques and we do all kinds of stuff. And it's wonderful. It's wonderful therapy. And I'm almost back to being sort of human again.
Well, I want to thank you, Leslie, for sharing so generously. And I'm pleased to sort of share all the wonderfulness I know that you are with, our audience. And I guess, Sam, we can sort of take some questions. I hope we have some time for that.
Yeah, applaud on behalf of everyone here, and thank you both so much. The strange worlds of Zoom is really, I think you lived up to the expectations, Lowery. But thank you both. And yeah, if anyone, I see a couple of questions. If you have any question, please do put it in and maybe we'll get some conversation going for as long as Leslie and Lowery feel up to it. There is one question in here. We'll start with this. This is from Christopher Lyon.
Oh, hi, Chris.
Good friend.
Wow, a blast from the past.
And he says, as an editor who had the privilege of working with both of these extraordinary scholars, I want to ask, what role do publications play in advancing awareness of the artists and work you have been discussing?
Wow, Chris, did you hear our early conversation before we even became live? We were talking about the fact that there are so many publications now that Lowery and I are being asked to have our essays reprinted because these seminal publications now are out of print. Working with you on the Global Africa Project, which Lowery didn't even mention, because Lowery and I have done a number of projects together, was one of the greatest achievements professionally. And people they walk around with it like it was a Bible under their arms, using it and referring to it to this day. And so, while things are going digital, there is nothing like a hard copy to have to study, because digital is easy access, but there is nothing like a real document that gives you the presence of what that project was all about.
Yeah, I agree. I think the other thing too is that digital is too prone to, transmorgifying and changing and disappearing into the ether. So I think now, as much as people really are enamored with sort of digital interactions in the arts, the sort of catalog, the brochure, the book, is still a very important aspect for preserving art history.
This question is from Nancy Proctor. They're
Hi,
asking,
Nancy.
what will you two be collaborating on next in Baltimore?
We don't have any. We don't have any. Oh yeah, we do have a plan. Jeez. Oh
yes,
yeah.
we do. Yes, we do. We're always plotting and planning.
And we can't talk about it because it's in the planning stages. But I can also talk about the fact that I'm working with Olitha Devane, one of the girls of Baltimore, who's having a survey of her work at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County Galleries, that will open in September 2022.
Yes. And then the other ones we will be, as they become more formulated, we will be able to share with you. But these projects that we collaborate on are often projects that we play around with and we say, what if, how about, perhaps? And they're usually outside of anything that people had thought about. So, it's the fun work that we get to do to pull artists who have had little to no visibility or need to have the kind of visibility to really frame out who they are in the art world in a much more explicit and distinctive way.
Yeah.
This question is from Anne Delaney. She's asking, we have been talking about work that is handmade and is in that aesthetic of the beautiful and symbolic object. Do you think the handmade will survive in the digital age?
Yeah, because when the electricity goes and we lose all the digital, we will have the hand.
Absolutely. And I think, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, I think that it's extraordinary now that the way that techniques like quilting are sort of flooding into the so-called fine arts, so that they're almost equivalents with what we would call painting, and the number of artists who are doing mixed media, painting, quilting, photography, print, work. So I think definitely, and the interesting thing about quilting is that it's become this kind of almost, what do I want to say, a trope for African American culture, in a way that it always has been, but now is really overt. And it's really striking the number of male artists who are manipulating quilts, using quilts, or mimicking quilts. One thinks of Sanford Biggers and Hank Willis Thomas. There's also Jesse Crimes, who's a white artist who was in prison, who does incredible quilts. I think he's based in Philadelphia. So, something that was just, like handwork for women. And then just the sort of permutations of what's happening to all the different members of the Gee's Bend quilting community is interesting. There's Lisa Collins is at the National Gallery with me this year, and she's just given an incredible presentation on a project she's doing about a quilt by Missouri Petaway, which is in the collection of the National Gallery. And the Baltimore Museum has just acquired a number of works by Gee's Bend quilters. So, I think handwork is just going, crazy. Artists using open weave and sort of deconstructed weaving. I think it's really fascinating to me how that's really come on very strong in the last couple of years.
Desmond, this question's from Desmond Beach. They say, you mentioned earlier the connection between spirituality and African diaspora within work. I was wondering what your thoughts are on hearing and being guided by ancestral voices in making art.
I am always awed that as I pick up a piece of fabric, I envision myself sitting next to my grandmother at the sewing machine on a little stool. And my first revelation in the awesomeness of how you can take abstract pieces of cloth, which is what they look like to me as a child, and put them together to make incredibly beautiful crafted garments. And so every time I go to sew, whether I am sewing with the machine or I'm doing what the Japanese call slow stitch with the needle and the thread, all right, I am always hearing these ancestors talk to me. I have done a lot of writing on the installations I do are really a tribute to my grandmother's spirituality, because she tended the altars of her church, as well as the acolytes, the choir master, and the priest. She made all of their garments. She endowed them with beautiful embellishments, all beautifully hand detailed. And so while she was not a Bible-toting religious person, her spirituality, I read through the technology. I call them needle technicians, who use the needle like they use a stylus for a print, or a chisel for a sculpture, or a brush for a painting. They draw with needle and thread. And so I am always hearing these voices, and I always hear her, you know, when I finish a project, the first thing she would say, well, Leslie Ann, turn it over. And that would mean, is the underside or the inside as beautiful as the outside?
Mhm.
Okay, so there are messages. I've worked with Aminah Brenda Richardson, the sculptor, Amalia Amaki, Elizabeth Talford Scott. All of these are Joan Gaither. These are masterful quilters. All right, and all of them are deeply spiritual individuals, and so the colors talk to us through a spiritual energy. The tools that we use are very important. We don't discount any of that. And then if you go back to looking at how African cloth was created, and I've been studying African patterns, especially, you see here, I have this Kuba cloth, the Kuba cloths, all of these patterns have to do with spiritual and proverbs and stories that are woven in to the designs, into the designs. So it's inescapable within the diaspora that these things were intricate and integral to the creativity of the piece. It just wasn't to make something look pretty to put on a sofa or a table or whatever. There was much more involved in it.
Well, I think also Lisa Collins sort of talked about with Missouri Petaway, the particular piece of the National Gallery, I believe was done with her father's garments after he died.
Mm-hmm.
The way that, you know, quilters, you know, I mean, we go out and buy fabrics too, but I mean, the reuse of garments and materials that belong to other people sort of reverberate in a sense. And I think that, you know, Leslie's quite eloquent about her own familial relationship to this. I mean, I have one too, but in my household, it was slightly looked down upon and disparaged, you know, like it's not important. But my grandmother quilted, my aunt quilted, and I still have, my sister and I have two surviving quilts, you know, that we hang on to. And when I was younger, I liked to sew, I liked to, you know, crochet and knit. And my sister became a great knitter. But, you know, for our family, it was sort of the intellectual pursuits that were more important. So this is the point in my life, in conversation with Leslie and hearing Lisa talk so beautifully about doing her research on the quilt. I'm sort of reconnecting and realizing what this means in my own life. And I think each one of us needs to do that because everybody had some aunt, some grandmother.
That's right.
Who did something and brought some interesting sort of works over, you know, but they just, you know, sometimes get lost in the transom.
Well said. There's a couple more comments here if we have time. Really enjoying listening to both of you talk, and there's a comment from Grace Rosselli. They say, "Would a joint memoir be part of your
Grace.
It is another comment here from Lorna, who says that her great-grandmother was blind, and as she would crochet incredibly complex patterns,
Interesting.
her footsteps and asked her to give her the blue yarn and then another color later on. Very interesting.
Interesting.
I think you spoke to this a little bit more, but maybe we could just end on this. Is from Catherine Bickford asking, how have you seen the acceptance of craft as fine art change in your career? And you, I mean, I see it in galleries here in Chelsea. You know, there's a lot of artists.
When I joined MAD in 2007, you know, this was after a period I was, you know, at the directing the studio museum. So I wasn't really doing, curatorial work. I was fundraising. And going back into the galleries at that moment, I was totally blown away by all of the kind of crafty things that were sort of going on, and how people who would have been put into a craft category were, being shown at Matthew Marks, Gagosian, and so, and that was part of the rationale why Holly Hutchner and David McFadden, who were the senior curators when I came into Med, had sort of worked on branding the American Folk Art Museum to the Museum of Arts and Design to sort of indicate that broader situation. What I've seen, so like over the last 14 years, I've seen it ebb and wave back and forth, like it seems like it stretched for a bit, and then, it kind of like lessened a little, but it never went away. And now I think there's a real flourishing, for it. And I don't know, I'm sure that somebody has done an article sort of talking about it as a kind of antidote to all the kind of focus on digital work, because I think that there's always an impulse, to use the hand and bring the hand into creativity that is eternal.
There's also, the conditions of the time that we're living in now. So many people who really had not been active in the DIY movement, do-it-yourself movement, had to find things to mitigate the stresses and the traumas of being in lockdown and to being in this unprecedented moment in history. And so for many people to look back on your life and to look back on things that you had always sort of wanted to do, but didn't do, or you can't get out to do them, so I have to figure out how to do them myself. I'm sure that somebody's going to do a study and look at the sales that have occurred in craft and supply markets. I'll tell you one thing that knocked me out. The other night, I'm going to the dollar store to pick up Christmas decorations real cheap. I go in there and I'm walking through and I see 2 full aisles. I could not have been more shocked of craft supplies, beading and tapes and paints and canvases. And I went, oh my God, between remote learning, between the lockdown, between this radical shift, do you understand? People have had to find ways to keep their children occupied, keep themselves occupied. Artists have had to find new venues, new avenues of expression. And this was a perfect time. It's like this was truly a perfect storm where people were in a situation where they could experiment with materials and play around with things traditionally that had not been in their sphere or their scope or their plan. So the hand is not going anywhere, unless we become aliens and they, take them off, whatever. The hand is going to be there. The brain is going to be there. The question is how are artists, how are makers, how are creatives going to expand the dialogue, the discourse about what creativity looks in the future? And so I think that there is going to be a morphing, at which we have already seen. I mean, Bisa Washington is like, come on. She is just absolutely amazing, all right? Short of having been, painted canvases. But again, it's a reminder of what we experienced when we saw the G's Benz quilts first hung on the walls in the museums, all right? Now we're looking at men who are engaging so-called women's work. Well, this is the work of life's work. Because the other thing is that, Americans suffer from this propensity of accumulation. What do you do with all of this stuff? And then when you look at the stuff and it has a memory, it has a past life, do you just throw it away? Or do you find another way to give it a new life? So I think that these are so many more questions. There are so many more questions that are going to be posed and materials that are going to be used, because fiber is not just cotton, wool, silk, you know, or nylon. All right. It can be metal. It can be anything. And people can interpret it any way they want. But again, it's the hand and the mind and the eye.
Amen.
Yeah, amen to that. I think that's a wonderful note to end on, and I just really have enjoyed this conversation. And I want to thank our audience members for joining in, and just Dr. King-Hammond, you know, just listening to you speak on your work as a teacher and as an artist is very inspiring, and I think our students will have a lot to take from this. So
Yes.
thank you both so much. And there's a lot of comments coming in about thank yous from the audience. So I hope you both have a wonderful evening, and I'll leave you with the last word. But thank you.
Bye.
All right.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Good night. Thanks.
Good night.